universal religion and spiritual practice. In keeping with the spirit of unity and diversity, we honor the spiritual traditions of diverse cultures. Our mission is to foster mutual respect for all cultural, spiritual, and religious practices. By extending friendship, seeking common ground, and transcending differences, we join together to build bridges of cross-cultural harmony and world peace. This morning we are pleased and privileged to have Debashish Banerjee with us to speak on Sankhya and the Integral Yoga. Debashish Banerjee is the Haridas Chaudhuri Professor of Indian Philosophies and Cultures and the Doshi Professor of Asian Art at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Before we start, I would like to offer a prayer from the Prayers of Affirmation written by Haridas Chaudhuri. This one is called The Inner Guide. Om Brahman Shatyam Shivam Sundaram. Reality is the one light that shines in various forms, the one voice that speaks in various languages, the one life that pulsates in endless variations. The way to behold the infinite light is by discovering the inner light that glows in the depth of our soul. The way to hear the divine voice is by listening to the inner void that rings in the silence of our being. The way to contact universal life is by following the self-regulating rhythm of our inner life force. May we follow the guidance of the inner light in all changing circumstances. May we follow the prompting of the inner voice in all the details of our living. And may we grasp the significance of the inner life force, setting aside all external standards. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. May peace be with you.
Thank you as well.
Thank you. Okay, please welcome Debashish Banerjee.
Thank you, Rita. Thanks, everybody. It is by now a tradition for me to come at Sri Aurobindo's birthday and give a talk here at CIF. Today, I'm just a little off tradition, just 1 week late. My good friend Robert did the talk, beat me to it last weekend. But it's, as always, a great honor, a privilege, and heartwarming experience to be with you all and share ideas pertaining to Sri Aurobindo and the Mother at this time of the year. So today I thought we can discuss something that is a little more theoretical maybe, but practical all the same, which is Sankhya and the Integral Yoga. Now, Sri Aurobindo, for those of you who have read his texts, often enters into these tracts of reference to the Indian philosophical tradition. And one of the areas that he repeats is this term Sankhya. He talks about Sankhya often and ideas related to Sankhya. So, along with many other such notions, it's often a question mark that remains in the mind as to what exactly he meant, where is he drawing from, what is the tradition that he's referring to, and how does that really fit into the Integral Yoga. So Sankhya today, I've chosen that term. There's many other terms that he uses out of the Indian tradition. But the reason I chose that term is that it has independently developed some amount of value in our times through happenstance, through the fact of the large proliferation. Oh, I think I haven't turned this one on. Sorry, is this better? Hello?
Yeah.
So through the fact that there is a sudden blooming of yoga studio culture across the West, and yoga studios that are particularly focused on the physical asanas or the physical exercises that are related to yoga, what is in India called Hatha Yoga, nevertheless have a text that they hold important, and that text is the Yoga Sutra. Yoga Sutra is one of the major texts, perhaps the foundational text for yoga studios that are promoting Hatha Yoga. Now, Yoga Sutra itself is not primarily about Hatha Yoga. And the Hatha Yoga tradition itself is hardly primarily for itself. Hatha Yoga today has become really big as a branch of yoga due to the fitness needs of the modern world. But it has its background also in a relatively recent reinvention that goes back to the nationalist period in India. The importance that Hatha Yoga practices are given today in the world really draws back to the colonial period, and the fact that a few teachers, a prominent one among them being somebody called Swami Kuvalayananda, developed this tradition as a means of resisting British oppression. So the biopolitics of Hatha Yoga needs to be kept in mind when we think of how it has emerged into our times from more obscure beginnings, where it was used in other schools like Tantra, for example, or more importantly in schools that had to do with the attainment of samadhi. So if we look at the text, the Yoga Sutra, which is a text of yoga, now the term yoga again becomes a problematic term because it can mean a number of things, not all converging, some overlapping. But yoga is the name of a school of practice. And if you think about it as a school of practice, we see that Yoga Sutra is the principal text related to that school of practice. And Yoga Sutra has its own several step process that culminates in what is called samadhi, or deep trance, a trance that ultimately separates one from the rest of the world, though it could bring another consciousness into engagement with the rest of the world. So it's in any case a transcendence, an experience of transcendence that is being offered. And the Hatha Yoga is one limb out of an 8-limb process that has to do with that. So that's the way in which the Yoga Sutra, or yoga as a term, becomes related to the great proliferation of yoga studio culture in the world today. The Yoga Sutra itself is based on a metaphysical schema. That metaphysical schema is called Sankhya. So now, if we look at the roots of these schools, we find that around maybe 12th to 16th century sometime, a certain kind of classification of what are called Astika religions, or Astika philosophical schools. Astika literally means, asti means to exist. In other words, schools that are affirmative of the existence of reality. That is, these are schools that feel that experience that we are having is real. These schools ultimately take their authority from the Veda. And these schools become classified in a system called the six darshanas. This classification of six darshanas is, considering the history of Indian philosophy, not that old. It's only from about, as I said, 12th to 16th century that this classification arises. And these six are given in terms of three pairs. One pair is Nyaya and Vaisheshika. Another pair is Mimamsa and Vedanta. And the third pair is Yoga and Samkhya, or Sankhya and Yoga, however you want to put it. Now, we don't have time to go into what these various schools are, but I've come down to Samkhya and Yoga. They're related because they share a common metaphysical foundation, and that foundation is what we are calling Sankhya. The difference is in the fact that their primary texts are different and their methods are different. Their methods are slightly different, but their goals are aiming at the same direction, though there may be a question mark about that if we delve deep enough into the pasts of these schools. So, yoga as a discipline is, takes its legendary foundation from Patanjali. Patanjali is a figure that is controversial. We don't know when he begins. There is a Patanjali that has been located in the 2nd century BCE, who's a grammarian. And the Yoga Sutra text, if we study it in terms of its literary, if you look at it, other literature of its time, its comparative literary belonging is more to about the 5th century CE. It's not that old a text as the earlier Patanjali. So there is a sense that we are looking at another Patanjali, or we are looking at an attribution, just like all the Puranas are attributed to Vyasa. The Veda itself is attributed to Vyasa as an act of compilation. So there are figures like that, Vyasa, Patanjali, who may not necessarily have been a person, but an attribution. So you can see him, he's legendary enough. His lower part is that of a serpent, and his upper part is that he's a kind of what's called a zoomorph, partly serpent, partly human. And it has to do with the fact that there is a certain kind of a union of types of consciousness that is taking place. We are drawing on energies that are not normally thought of as part of the spectrum of the human, that go down to our animal roots and go up to divine roots. And this is exactly what, in a way, the symbolism of the image shows. Now, Sri Aurobindo utilizes Sankhya in his writings, as I said, in an interesting way. And that's partly what this talk today is about. Now, Sankhya, which I said is the metaphysical scheme, goes back to somebody called Kapila. So the attribution of Sankhya is to Kapila. And when does Kapila make his appearance in history? We don't know. Many people feel that Sankhya is really ancient because it's like a bedrock that many other schools are drawing from. But if we compare with the Veda and the Upanishads, it's only some of the later Upanishads that start utilizing some of the terms that make their appearance in Sankhya, particularly the term Prakriti. Now, I'll come to that term in a moment. But there are two really important terms in Sankhya and Yoga. And these terms are going to be used by Sri Aurobindo as well. They are Purusha and Prakriti. So, Purusha, has been translated in a variety of ways. Sri Aurobindo himself talks about these ideas in a few key chapters of a few key texts. In the Synthesis of Yoga, you will find a chapter called Soul and Nature. And there, you could see that his translation of Purusha is soul, and his translation of Prakriti is nature. These are simplified translations. In the Life Divine, he has a long chapter, very long chapter, called, I believe it's called Brahma, Ishvara, Purusha, Maya, Prakriti, Shakti. 6 terms I used. Here again, he introduces this notion of Sankhya and Purusha and Prakriti. And in his epic Savitri, there is a really important canto called The Secret Knowledge, in which he talks about this idea of Sankhya in poetic terms. But there too, it's two gendered polarities, a gendered polarity of a male and a female, a he and a she, that are being categorized as Purusha and Prakriti. Now, etymologically, the term Purusha is probably better translated as person. Even if you hear the sound Purusha and person, you could sense the Indo-European affinities of this term. Person, it's person. And Prakriti is, if you look at the Kriti, which is also related to English terms like create, it is to do, create, or Kriti, or karma, or kriya, all have to do with acting, doing. And the prefix pra is a putting in front, is a pushing out or putting in front. Prakriti, therefore, is a compulsion to action. Various kinds of compulsions to action constitute the field of Prakriti. So these are the two major terms that are used in Sankhya as well as in Yoga. The word Purusha makes its first appearance in the Veda. So this is, we are looking at least something as old as 1,500, 1,000, maybe if it's a little later, it's the last book of the Rig Veda, the 10th volume. If we say the 10th volume came later, maybe 1,300 BC. And then the term Purusha appears in an early Upanishad called the Aitareya Upanishad. We'll see how it does that in a little bit. And then in these texts, the word Prakriti does not appear. There's no term Prakriti in the Veda or in the early Upanishads. But in a somewhat later but important Upanishad, Shvetashvatara Upanishad, the term Prakriti makes its appearance, along with another term Maya, which also does not appear before that in the Upanishads, but makes a certain appearance in this Upanishad that may be thought to be around the 2nd century BC. So Purusha and Prakriti together in an Upanishad is appearing around this time. So we could say that Sankhya has already arrived, and the Upanishads are referring to some of the ideas. So it's occurring sometime in the period from maybe 4th century BC to 2nd century BC. The Bhagavad-Gita is another historical marker for understanding when these ideas come. Because if some of you have read the Bhagavad-Gita, from chapter 2 on, a large part of the Bhagavad-Gita is a revisioning and dialogue with the ideas of Sankhya and Yoga. It's going to voice its arguments in terms of Sankhya and Yoga. So evidently by the time the Gita has arrived, both Sankhya and Yoga are well established. And this formalism that we are talking about, the metaphysical formalism of Sankhya, already exists, though it is not what we find in the Yoga Sutra or in the most popular text on Sankhya today, which is called the Sankhya Karika. The Sankhya Karika and Yoga Sutra are considered to be both around 4th to 5th century CE. The Gita could be anywhere between the 4th century BCE to the 2nd century CE. It's a long period in which Mahabharata and Gita are being written. They are being shaped, made larger. And the central crest jewel of the Mahabharata is the Gita. So we find that maybe sometime 5th century, 4th century, 3rd century BC, the ideas of the Gita are making their appearance. And by the time we come to the 2nd century, these ideas of the Gita are being voiced in terms of certain prevailing philosophical notions and schools, two important ones of which are Sankhya and Yoga. Now, I'm going through all this to try to arrive at a sense of what is Sankhya. To understand that, we need to also look at the term itself. What is the term Sankhya and what does it mean? The word Sankhya means count. Sankhya means count. How many is Sankhya? The word Sankhya means enumeration. It's derived from Sankhya. In other words, the abstract of counting. Enumeration is Sankhya. The process of enumerating is Sankhya. So it shows us a certain kind of mindset right away. A mindset that enumerates. Now if we compare it with the body of Indian philosophical writing from the earliest periods, we find that to talk about a mindset of enumerating things is not the same as the earliest ways in which Indian philosophy has worked. We also notice that early Indian philosophy has defined its own mindset by the names that it has given to itself. For example, the term Veda, which literally means knowledge, comes to mean revealed knowledge. Its mindset is very different. The mindset is that of seeing. The subject of the Veda is the rishi or the kavi, the seer and the poet. The poet who voices inspiration that is not from oneself, that is coming in an unauthored form after preparing the being to become a medium for this poesy. The Upanishads also have a literal meaning. They mean to sit near. And the difference between the Veda and the Upanishad is immediately apparent. Veda is claiming to be unauthored knowledge coming from on high in a perfect revealed form to people. The Upanishads is drawing a distinction between itself and this mindset. It's saying, we are not the revealed form. We are the intimate form. We are humanity in close relationship with the truth. We are humanity in initiatic circles where we sit intimately together and discuss and receive what is beyond us. So the speech of the Upanishads is not like the speech of the Veda. It isn't this coded symbolic speech that only revelation can uncode. It is philosophical speech, or what we may call proto-philosophical speech, because it is not really about carrying through an argument. It is about showing a certain perception, revealing an intuition. It is about giving us ideas that when we contemplate on them, they open up a certain view of things. So that is the mode of thinking behind the Upanishads. Enumeration is something else. Enumeration means that we have begun teaching. Enumeration is clearly related to mnemonics, remembering. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Enumeration means that there is a trend to go out of the initiatic circles to the polis, to talk to people and tell them, do this, give them an algorithm, give them a sequence of steps to carry out. So Sankhya is really an enumeration in all these ways. It's an enumeration in the sense that it is telling you, let us put down into steps what you need to do. Let us put down into a collection, a set, what you need to practice or look at. It is also using enumeration as a much more practical tool, which is, let us put down in steps what you need to exhaust. Because what we are trying to give you is a negative theology. A negative theology. A negative theology means what remains after the positive has been removed. What cannot be talked about, what cannot be given a name, the nameless. Now, this is not something absent in the Upanishads. There are ideas like this in the Upanishads. For example, the idea of neti neti, which occurs in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It is saying, how is truth to be known? It is to be known by denials. In other words, what do you take truth to be? Whatever is apparent to us. Let us look at it and say, maybe there's something else than what is apparent to us. Let's deny this appearance. Now, if I can deny the appearance, maybe I experience something below the appearance. And then once I can really put my attention on that, I can say, let me deny this as well. Is there something even behind this? In other words, it's a reduction. Can we take the reduction far enough so that we arrive at the nameless, an experience that can be no further reduced? Now, this is negative theology. And we find that the Upanishad is pointing at this possibility without making it into an enumeration. Now, when we come to Sankhya, we find that a new method is being given to us, a method of negative theology based on enumeration. So, if we are to give it a certain kind of succinct statement, we'd say Sankhya is an empirical negative theology of epistemological enumeration. Let's unpack that. Negative theology we get. Epistemological enumeration means how do we know? What is our method of knowing? Can I reduce to necessary and sufficient conditions how I can know? What would be a statement of how I can know? It would mean that there is an engine of knowledge, an instrument of knowledge that is being utilized to know. And there is a world out there that is related to this instrument of knowledge, which is the object of knowledge. There's an instrument of knowledge and an object of knowledge that are tied to each other. And this being tied to each other is to be given a description. This knowledge system is to be given a description which is a necessary and sufficient description. No more, no less, right? And nothing that is not necessary. So, it's another reduction. It's a reduction to what are the bases of knowing and what is known. So, this is the epistemological enumeration that we are talking about. Why empirical? Empirical because though there is a metaphysics to it, which is what Sankhya is all about, that's what we are coming to, we really don't need it. It's not important, but it's interesting. It's interesting because it's evolutionary, but it's unimportant because you don't need it to practice it. You don't need it. In a way, if you have your mind set on the kinds of things I'm saying, you'd realize that many of the characteristics that I'm talking about can be also shared with Buddhism. Buddhism also doesn't need its metaphysics. It can practice directly without really telling you, and it tries to tell you as little as possible, except for what you need to practice. Therefore, it's a method of teaching. A method of teaching that is really related to going out there to the people and telling them what they're ready to hear based on their everyday experience. And to start with foundations of everyday experience is to be empirical. It's your sensory experience that is being acknowledged and nothing more. Therefore, it is empirical. So, this is really what I wanted to say about the difference in mindset between Veda, Upanishad and Sankhya. So, if Sankhya, looking at it historically, is to make its appearance, it must be post-Vedic. It's probably either post-Upanishadic or in the middle period of the Upanishads. And it belongs to a sociological movement in which the teachings of the Upanishads that are developing on the peripheries of society are returning to the society, just as Buddhism is in the 5th century BC. Okay. So this is one of these movements that are happening, maybe in a time period closer to the 5th, 4th or 3rd century, in which wise people are going out into the city and telling every man there, you don't need to know a lot of metaphysics. You can take your own experience and do certain things, and you'll find a solution to the problems that you have. Now, yoga, the entire vast field of yoga, and here I'm not talking about this, just the school yoga, follows this kind of method. It's the philosophy of yoga has to do with first defining for yourself what you want out of life. If you don't know what you want out of life, then you don't know what yoga you want to follow. So the Buddha, for example, had a single problem. These are problems of becoming. His problem was, how can I find the solution to suffering? And one can't say that the answer he gave or the solution he's found was the only solution. It was one solution. It satisfied him. But there can be other solutions to the same problem. However, the problem is first necessary. The problem of Sankhya is very similar to the problem of the Buddha. It is, how can I find a solution to the suffering of human experience? This is the question. This is one of the prevailing questions of that time. Many people are discussing this question. And they're going out into the polis, into the town, into a community and a population that has a lot of suffering, and saying there is a way out of suffering. And if you follow these steps, you will get out of suffering. Here are the steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It's an enumeration. Now, for Samkhya, the enumeration takes on a deeper quality, because they say, this enumeration is not merely a way by which you can remember what to do, but this enumeration is the very method by which you will arrive at what you're aiming for, which is the freedom from the structures of experience. Why is it the method? Because it is by enumerating that we exhaust what reality is not. This is its negative theology. Enumeration is its negative theology. Okay. So this is how Sankhya makes its appearance. Okay. The best known text for Sankhya today is the Sankhya Karika, written by Ishvara Krishna, perhaps around the 4th century. And as I said earlier, the associated school related to Sankhya is Yoga, attributed to Patanjali, and its best known text today is the Yoga Sutra, about the 5th century CE, if we are to believe the literary evidence. Now, what is Sankhya? You can see a diagram for it over there. And let me touch on the diagram, but I'll also move down here. So if you wish to, you can look at the metaphysics, at the irrelevant metaphysics of Sankhya. Firstly, Sankhya is going to say that there are two. It's a school of duality. It's not a monistic school. It's a dualistic school. There are two fundamental things in reality. And then these two things are also not really two things. They are one thing on one side and infinite things on the other side. Prakriti, which is what Sri Aurobindo is translating as nature, right? Some people are translating it as matter. You'll find this translation, in, say, Jerry Larson and other people today. But it's definitely not matter. Nowhere is it identifying itself as matter. It's a principle. Prakriti as a principle is one. There is only one Prakriti. We may even call it world. We find ourselves in a world. The world is one. We share this world. We can call it nature, we can call it world, we can call it the matrix of activities in which we find ourselves. These activities are going on outside us, but they're going on inside us as well. On the other hand, you have consciousness. This is why Sri Aurobindo translates the other side as soul. There is consciousness. We have an uneasy sense that we are conscious beings in an unconscious world. Well, all around us there is some consciousness and there is some unconsciousness. Now, the uneasy sense arises from the fact that we can't differentiate the two. They are all mixed up. We feel we're partly conscious and we are partly not conscious. So, the question that arises out of that, the question of becoming that arises out of that is, can we separate the two? So Sankhya's metaphysics begins by saying, yes, you can, because there are two realities to this cosmos. One is a matrix of activities that operate by themselves and are not conscious, and the other is consciousness in terms of every individual that can be called conscious that inhabits that particular matrix. That matrix is not merely what is outside our bodies, it's inside our bodies as well. So Sankhya is going to look at the complex of subject and object, except it's not going to call subject until it can eradicate all constituents of instrumentation from subject. Anything that can be called a constituent of instrumentation is object, not subject. It is part of the experiential or epistemological complex. How do we know? And how do we experience? Now, already you may say, there is a privileging of knowing going on over here. I mean, if you're going to reduce our structures to what makes us know the world, how do we know? What is the definition of knowing that we're going to give to it? So we find that the definition of knowing given to it by Sankhya is largely mental. So let us look at what is this complex. This is how the complex occurs. The metaphysics is saying, how does consciousness associate itself with the matrix of activities? How does Purusha associate itself with Prakriti? We don't know. We are not going to even look there. We are not interested in it. That question is prior to our experience. We find ourselves in a situation in which consciousness has come into association with the matrix of activities. Soul is in association with nature. If that happens, then this matrix of activities becomes disturbed. Why does it get disturbed? They will say that there are within that matrix three possibilities of activity. They are what are called the qualities of gunas. The gunas are three because there is a tendency to remain inert. Something is there in nature that wants to remain inert. Something is there that wants to change all the time. And something is there that wants to become more intelligent, understand to a greater extent what is happening. These three becomes the three modes or qualities of nature, what are called the gunas. These gunas are latent in each other, in the matrix of activities called Prakriti or Mula Prakriti, root Prakriti. They are in equilibrium. There is no movement. As soon as a soul associates, as soon as consciousness associates itself with this matrix, there is a disequilibrium. Because that in it which wants to remain inert, breaks away and remains inert. That in it which wants to change immediately starts changing, because it thinks to itself, there's a foreign element in my vicinity, I should start changing. That in it which wants to understand things more becomes active, because it wants to know what it is that it has come into contact with. This causes an evolution to occur. And you can see that in the diagram. The evolution is really something that is going in a bottom-up form. This is Mula Prakriti, or this is the equilibrium state. In an uncreated equilibrium state, if we look at the sattvic element, in other words, the intelligent element in Prakriti is going to generate something called intelligence. Intelligence is the attribute of nature that is closest to consciousness. It is not yet consciousness. It mimics consciousness. It's a mirror for consciousness. So this is where, if we think about this difference, the dualism of soul and nature, it's different from the dualism of mind and body that we find in Descartes, for example. Because mind is also an aspect of nature, just as body is. And soul is neither mind nor body. Soul cannot be given a name. That's why it remains. It's the residue after all the constituents of nature have been talked about and discarded. So the first thing that arises is intelligence. The next thing that arises is an attribute of Prakriti called the I maker. Ahamkara is really the I maker. It is the engine that causes ego to appear. Ego appears, a sense of I appears in that which had a soul. Okay? So you may say that it is the reflection of the soul in this matrix of activities, unconscious matrix of activities. Then there comes a relationship with the tamasic element, with the inertial element. And part of the inertial element differentiates into the 5 elements of matter, okay, which have both what we call gross and subtle components to them. And they are, as you can see over here, space, air, fire, water, and ether. To receive it subjectively, there is the subjective side, the subtle elements, sound, touch, form, taste, and smell. To connect these to the instrument of knowing, you have the senses, ear, skin, eye, tongue, and nose. And to act upon the word from the evidence of the senses, you have the 5 organs of action, the mouth, arms, legs, excretory and reproductive organs. Now this is the interface between the knowing system and the object of knowledge. The evidence of the senses are going to travel up to what is called the sense mind, the 11th organ, or the manas. In other words, the processing that is going to take the evidence of the senses and create a certain picture out of it, or a certain reality out of it. Now that is then going to be understood by the intelligence. The intelligence understands it. The ego attaches itself to that understanding, saying, this is my understanding. And that will become our basis of existence and experience in the world. Okay, so this is the phenomenological reduction to the act of knowing that is being given to us by Sankhya. And you can see this, it's really it bears contemplation, because you can see how beautifully they have reduced the subject-object relation so that we can see how it operates and how we take ourselves as knowing a world in which knowing is taking place due to a certain mechanism. A mechanism of knowing is active, and a world of knowing is active. Who are we in all this? Sankhya is going to say, we are none of these things. We take ourselves to be the knower because we are stuck in this thing called the ego, the ahankara. That is a center within the Prakriti itself. It's within the Prakriti itself. So how are we going to escape from this engine? Note, however, right now you can see that this entire description is slanted towards knowing. See, it's the mental instrument that you're being given. That also is it's an interesting thing. It shows us a certain period in time in which the human being is being reduced to a knower. Not necessarily a person of emotion, for example. A poet. Not necessarily a person of will who does active things in the world. Primarily a person of knowledge, a knower. Okay? So, how do we arrive at the freedom that we seek? So here from towards the end of the Sankhya Karika, we see what has been given to us. Thus, from the practice of the 25 tattvas, note that there are 25 over here, okay, 5, 10, 15, 20, 21, 2, 3, 4, and the 25th is Purusha. So, the practice of the 25 tattvas, from the practice of the 25 tattvas, wisdom of the form, there is no sense of being. Na asmi. Asmi is aham asmi. Asmi is am, to be. I am. There is no am. You see that the am has disappeared. Okay? There is no sense of being. No na asmi. No I am. No sense of possession. No me, in other words, no I have. And no sense of person, no aham, no I. These are three different constituents of our sense of ego. I am, that is the objective side of being, a self. I have, that is in fact the exterior objectification of the ego. And I, which is the subject, ultimately the root of the ego, they constitute our sense of self. All three have gone. Why? How? By the practice of the 25 tattvas. So what is this practice of the 25 tattvas? This is the wisdom that arises. Wisdom of the form, there is no sense of being, no sense of possession, and no sense of person arises, which is pure, absolute, and free from error and doubt. By this means, Purusha, like a pure witness, beholds nature which has ceased from productivity and from the 7 forms of evolution under influence of its freedom. These 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. These are the 7 forms of evolution. It has ceased from productivity and from the 7 forms of evolution under the influence of its freedom. Purusha has the awareness, she has been seen by me, and becomes indifferent. The other has the awareness, I have been seen, and ceases to act. Even if there is connection, there is no motive for evolution. So, going back, what is the practice of the 25 tattvas? The practice of the 25 tattvas is Sankhya. The practice of 25 tattvas is Sankhya, which means it is really enumerating these 7 forms of evolution to yourself as objects of concentration. You are objectifying your instrument of knowing to yourself and putting your attention on every constituent of that instrument to the point that you know none of this instrumentation of knowledge is me. None of it is me. It is all instrument. And once you do that sufficiently, you come to the knowledge that this is not an I, it does not have anything, and it does not have a sense of being. This object that gives us knowledge then ceases to be an object. It disappears. And what remains is the nameless subject. The nameless subject, which is being given a name here, Purusha, but it is really a nameless subject. So it's going to be called Sakshi. Sakshi means witness. It's going to be called the witness. All that remains is the witness. And in a way, similar to Buddhism, where there is the extinguishment, there's the extinguishment of the flame. Nibbana. Nibbana doesn't just mean to not exist. Nibbana comes from a actual empirical practice. Nibbana has a everyday meaning. The everyday meaning of Nibbana is to put out a candle flame, a wick. To blow out a candle. That is what Nibbana means. So essentially it is the extinguishment of the sense of transient self, the sense of the self that changes. And what remains in its place? The nameless remains in its place. The nameless. Nibbana has another meaning. Nibbana in its active sense means to put out the flame. In its etymological sense, it means that which has no expression, without expression, free of expression. So we find that that which cannot be spoken about, that which cannot be put into the context of expressions, is the nameless that remains, that is the residue. It's the same thing that is happening in the way over here, except it's being called the witness. It's pure witness. One could do an entire comparison with this system, from this system to Husserl, and look at phenomenology as a similar reduction that is trying to arrive at what they're calling a transcendental ego. So it is a process that is not very different from Sankhya, except it doesn't go all the way. There isn't a tradition behind it. But Sankhya is a tradition that is taking the instrumentation of knowledge and negating it to arrive at that which is prior to our knowing, which is nameless and true, yet neutral and inert. So this is what Sankhya is. Sri Aurobindo is going to use this But I'm going to jump this. This is how yoga does it. Several of you probably know these. Yoga Sutra has 4 chapters. And the main method is given as Ashtanga Yoga, or the 8-fold path of yoga. And it has these 8 paths that you probably know: yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, of which only the last 3 are the real goals of yoga. This is also an enumeration. You have been given 8 steps. The Buddha's first sermon is also an enumeration. You are being given 8 steps there too. You are being given a folded enumeration. You are being given 4 steps, and then this collapsed 4th step is being expanded into 8 steps. It's a mnemonic device, and it belongs to a time when you are teaching through these devices. Now, the first occurrence of Purusha, however, is much older than this. And this is where we start seeing Sri Aurobindo's ambiguity about the use of Sankhya. He's using Sankhya, and I'll get to the point where we'll see how Sankhya, in its own formulation, is being entirely utilized by him and yet overpassed. He's not stopping at Sankhya. He's not stopping at Sankhya's understanding of itself, particularly not at Sankhya's understanding of Purusha. So, Purusha has its origins way back in the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda. There, Purusha is reality itself as person. Okay? In a way, you may say it's a theistic reality. Purusha is the supreme person. Purusha is described as all that was and all that will be. There is nothing that can go out of it. In another, Brahmana, Shatapatha Brahmana, a character Narayana, is asked, what do you want to become? And he says, I want to become everything there is and everything there is not. I mean, how much more? It's like he's using the law of excluded middle of the mind to define reality. Everything that is X and everything that is not X. So this kind of definition is being given to Purusha. Purusha is Brahman itself, but Brahman as a person. Now, I won't go into all the rest because this really tells you what that Purusha Sukta in the 10th mandala is doing. But basically, it's an entire theology right there of how the one is becoming many, and then how the many are reconstituting the one. In a way, a deep consideration of this can also show us that there is a background to the idea of the many souls and the one nature. Where did the many souls come from? Sankhya will tell you we are not interested in that question. The reason we are not interested is that we find ourselves as many souls. This is our experience. So by our empirical roots, we will avoid asking these theoretical or speculative questions about how we got here. We are here, and we take ourselves as we are. But Veda is going to answer in mythical terms about how we got here, because they're interested in how we can get back to where we came from. So they have a different view, a view that answers more questions than Sankhya asks. You see? So we find that this is the first appearance of Purusha, and the second appearance of Purusha is in an early Upanishad called the Aitareya Upanishad, in which we start seeing another term. In fact, that term is even more primary to the Upanishads from the very early period than Purusha. It is the term Atman. Atman, which has been translated as self, is one way in which we can understand conscious being. Conscious being, which is also called Brahman, in the earliest texts is used synonymously with the idea of Atman. Atman is not merely the individuation of Brahman in the innumerable souls that find themselves in this world. Atman is Brahman itself. Because conscious being is self. Conscious being has a sense of self. This sense of self becomes self multiplied into innumerable selves. But it doesn't stop being the one self there is. See? So, these terms, and particularly we'll find that there is a crystallization of three terms that are being utilized in the Upanishads synonymously, but in functionally different ways to talk about conscious being and reality. One is Brahman, one is Atman as self, one is Purusha, a person, and one is Ishvara, or Lord. And if we really contemplate these terms, we'll see why this is happening. Sense of self is the most essential sense. It is essence rather than sense. It is essence rather than sense, because there is no way by which you can tell yourself how you know that you are. You are. Therefore, being, self, is essence. But if you think of how you handle the world, what kind of a will you utilize, how that will relates to the world, the Lord of will is Ishvara. Ishvara, Ish means to, it's related to the term wish. Ish means to will. How does that essence will in the world? It wills as Lord, Ishvara, Isha. How does that essence exist in relation to other essences? It exists as person, Purusha. So we see these three terms. They are the same, yet they are functionally different. So in this particular Upanishad, we'll find that self is made more primary than person. And self, by concentrating on reality, on Brahman, causes to emerge from it the sense of person. Person becomes the matrix that will then become the engine of knowledge, the subject and the object, or the subject-object system. Person is itself subject, and person is itself exteriorized as object. This is how the Veda or the Vedanta, the Upanishads, become a coherent system that is monistic, not dualistic. And you could see how some of these ideas can easily translate into Samkhya in case we cut the metaphysics and just present the empirical roots. So, this is just to say that Purusha has an earlier meaning than what Sankhya gives it. Now this is going to, we just saw two earlier occurrences of Purusha, but now we turn to the post-Sankhyan literature of the Gita. Because as I said, the Gita is going to use these terms like Purusha, Prakruti, Sankhya and Yoga. So what does the Gita mean by this? Does it accept Sankhya as it is? The Gita is a really interesting text because it talks in terms of many of these schools that exist in its, either before it or in its own time. For example, Sankhya and Yoga. At the same time, it calls itself an Upanishad. Every chapter of the Gita is going to end by it identifying itself as an Upanishad. Thus ends such and such a yoga chapter in the Upanishad known as the Gita. So it is bringing back an understanding of reality that is going back to the Upanishads and the Vedas. And what may you think would be the relationship of that to Sankhya and Yoga? Well, for one, it would be a monistic teaching rather than a dualistic teaching. It would be an attempt to answer the questions of Sankhya that have not been answered and that make it a monistic teaching, or a single one reality related to Brahman. How does it relate to Brahman? That becomes the way. And the Gita is going to talk in terms of Sankhya and Yoga, but give us a new metaphysics of Sankhya. A completely different new metaphysics of Sankhya. And this is the basis of that. Upanishad has already given us a reality that is one and yet two. That two is not the two of soul and nature. It is the two of what are called Vidya and Avidya. Now, Vidya and Avidya, the terms are not used that often in the Gita, but it is in the background of the Gita. And it is really coming from a number of Upanishads. The Gita is going to tell you, the Gita is going to use the word Maya. But Gita's use of the word Maya is also not the same as, say, Shankara's use of the word Maya, which is later, of course. But the way in which Maya is understood later. Gita uses the term Yoga Maya. Gita uses the term Yoga Maya and says, Krishna says, by my Yoga Maya, I keep the world under a certain delusion. By my Yoga Maya, I do that. So this Yoga Maya is a power of yoga to create a reality. So we find already over here there is a person, a being, who is being called Krishna. But this Krishna is somebody who is prior to the manifestation called Krishna. And as this primordial being, we may call him Purusha, the original Purusha of the Rig Veda, who is creating a reality in which there are two halves, one which is subject to a delusion and one which doesn't have that delusion. What is the nature of this delusion? The Upanishads are very clear about this. This is the basis of the difference between Vidya and Avidya. Vidya means knowledge. Avidya means ignorance. The reason they are so called at the two ends or the two extremes of the veil of Maya is because Vidya, knowledge, arises from the fact that everything is one in that zone. In other words, even if there are many, they will know themselves as one. Their sense of being one is part of their makeup. In the Avidya, there are many, but the sense of being one has been removed from the picture. In other words, each one is the center of its own universe and cannot know any other one. Cannot know any other one. It can know it only by external symptoms. I can measure your girth, your height, describe your externalities, and then come to the illusion that I know who you are. I can know a little bit of your behavior from the past, from a variety of statistical predictions. But I don't know who you are, because I don't have the experience of you that I have of myself, which is what I was calling essence. Essence. How do I know that I exist? I don't know how you exist in the same way as I know that I exist. That's what makes us ignorant. This is why we are ignorant. And this is the characteristic of the field of Prakriti. The Gita is going to say reality is divided into these two zones, and there are three Purushas. Three Purushas, no longer the one Purusha and one Prakriti of Sankhya, but it's going to be talking about three Purushas and two Prakritis. There are three forms of Purusha that it calls Kshara, Akshara, and Purushottama. I'll come to them in a moment. And there are two forms of Prakriti that it is called Apara and Para. And the three forms of Para Brahman related to the three yogas, Jnana, Karma, and Bhakti, that are really Paramatman is related to Jnana, Parameshwara is related to Karma, and Purushottama is related to Bhakti. That third part we don't need to worry about right now, because for the purposes of this talk, we are only focused on the first three over here. Here is the part in the Gita that talks about the two Prakritis. And this is the reason I'm bringing all this in is, here's where we find Sri Aurobindo doing his own operations on Sankhya. He's pulling in the Gita. He's bringing in the Gita. And he says, this is how we have to understand Sankhya. We cannot understand it as it was given to us. See? Chapter 7. They tell us what are the components of Prakriti here. So you see over there, Bhumir, Apo, Analo, Vayu, Kham, Mano Buddhir Evacha, Ahamkara Ityam Me Bhinna, Prakritir Ashtadha. Earth, water, fire, air, space, mind, intellect, and ego. These are the 8 components of my material energy. Okay. Actually, what they not, material energy is a bad translation. Again, it's by one of these people who is translating Prakriti as matter. They are the 8 components of my Prakriti, he says over here. Prakriti Ashtadha, 8 constituents of my Prakriti. Such is my inferior energy. Aparayam itastu anyam prakritim vidhi me param. I have another Prakriti which is the supreme Prakriti. But different from this, so mighty armed Arjuna, know my supreme Prakriti, Para Prakriti. This has individualized itself. Jiva bhutam mahabaho jaya idam dharyate jagat. This has individualized itself to the creatures and is the foundation of this world. In other words, already we can see that the division into knowledge and ignorance is playing into this. There is a nature to the world of ignorance and there is a nature to the world of knowledge. Nature to the world of knowledge is the supreme nature, Para Prakriti. The nature to the world of ignorance is the inferior nature, apara prakriti. You know. So what we find is that Sankhya's prakriti is the prakriti of avidya, according to the Vedantic notion of the Gita. While there is a higher half that Sankhya as an empirical system will not talk about, where there is another kind of nature, or the supreme nature called Paraprakriti. Then it goes on in chapter 15 and talks about Purusha in similar terms. Dvau imo Purushau loke sharascha akshara evacha shara sarvani bhutani kutastho akshara uchyate. Two Purushas are there in this world, the changing and the changeless. All these existences are the changing, and what is at the summit is known as the changeless. In other words, we are being told that the Purusha that Sankhya was giving us is really that changeless thing at the summit. But something of Purusha has entered into the world. Something inside the changes of nature is conscious. Changes of nature are not entirely unconscious. Consciousness pursues them. Consciousness lives within the changes of nature. This is going to become the foundation of what Sri Aurobindo will call psychic being. Psychic being is also Purusha. Psychic being is immanent Purusha. The Purusha that is outside of the circulating system of changes is Kutastho. In other words, at the summit, one has to get out of these various constituents of experience and knowledge to arrive at that. But if we do that, what is the cost? The cost is we lost the world. This is the problem of Sankhya. The problem of Sankhya arises from the question of Sankhya. The question of Sankhya is, how can we be free from the suffering of human experience? It has an assumption in it. The assumption is human experience is suffering, is sorrowful. That is the primary assumption in it. And we have to get out of that. This is how we can get out of that. But the question is, what if we want to redeem this suffering existence? What if we don't want to get out of it? What if we want a perfect existence here? If there is no truth to this existence, if Purusha does not exist, it's only unconsciousness and its varieties of changes, then there is no redemption possible. But the Gita is coming in exactly at this point and saying, no, that same being that is free, above and outside of nature has entered into every particle of nature. God dwells in everything. This is what Sri Aurobindo was to experience in the Alipur jail. This is why at the end of the jail he said that prior to that he had experienced that the divine is outside, extra cosmic, outside of all this. Then he realized that the divine is the one energy that has become all this. But the third realization was that in every particle the divine was present fully present. This is Purusha. Purusha immanent in the changes of changing nature. Shara Purusha. So the Gita finds an operation of nature in the changing Prakriti, an operation of nature of Purusha in the changing Prakriti, a status of Purusha unchanging outside Prakriti, and a supreme Purusha that has become both of these. That is Krishna, that is Purushottama, that is the Purusha of the Rig Veda. the only one there is, the being that has entered into the becoming and also remains outside the becoming. This is what my dear friend Robert would call panentheism. That which remaining outside can also remain inside. So, two Purushas are there in this world, the changing and the changeless. All these existences are the changing, and what is at the summit is known as the changeless. But other than these is the Supreme Person, Purushottama, called the highest self, Paramatma, the indestructible Lord, Avyaya Ishvara, who pervading the three worlds sustains them. Note here that the three descriptions of God are given at the same time here. It is the Supreme Person, the Supreme Self, and the Supreme and Unchanging Lord. These are the three aspects of God that we can experience through the three yogas. Jnana Yoga is going to give us the Supreme Being and Self. Bhakti Yoga is going to give us the Supreme Person. And Karma Yoga is going to give us the Supreme Lord. This is why there are three names to the same being. And finding the Supreme Person is the linchpin, because the other two are attributes of the person. As I transcend the changing and am higher even than the changeless, I am celebrated as the Supreme Person, Purushottama, in the world and in the Vedas. He's making a connection to the Vedas because exactly it's the 10th mandala that he's referring to. This is Purusha of Purusha Sukta, who now in a post-Sankhya world, Gita finds the necessity of giving another name to, and therefore calls Purushottama. It's no longer enough because the waters have been muddied by Sankhya. They have already usurped the name of Purusha and given it another definition that the Gita did not, the Veda did not give it. Therefore, Gita has to come in and nuance that notion and give us three Purushas. Now, I'm not going to go through this, but just in passing, this is the schema of Kashmir Shaivism. And Sri Aurobindo does not refer to this, because Sri Aurobindo came across Kashmir Shaivism rather late. And when he came across it, he said that there's remarkable consonance between my system and this system. But he did not write about it at this point. But the reason I bring it up is Kashmir Shaivism does the same thing as the Gita does. It turns Sankhya into a monistic system that gives us a superstructure above the 25 tattvas of Sankhya. You can see these are all the 25 tattvas. These are the ones that we've talked about. And right up here you have Purusha and Prakruti. And then above that you have all this area, which is what we may call the Vidya, the nature in Vidya. So again we find the same two different types of relations between Purusha and Prakriti, one above and one below. And they are reconciled by Paramashiva right above, which is completely the same whether we look at it as Purusha or Prakriti. Now, as I said, Sri Aurobindo begins with this because this is the foundational yogic psychology. The yoga psychology that is at the heart of all the systems of India is Sankhya. Sankhya begins it, but it gets nuanced by these other schools. But, as I said, Sankhya had some deficiencies, and one of its deficiencies is that it's already an epistemological engine. It is bothered about knowledge. It is not bothered about love or action. And this is the reason why Sri Aurobindo has to correct that excess by going back to the Upanishads and looking at another definition of the human in which knowledge is only one of our constituents. And this is the Taittiriya Upanishad, in which we are known to have 5 bodies. One body is the physical body. Right? The physical body has its own reality. Another body is the vital body, the vital pranamaya sharira. The vital body wills and loves. It has emotions, feelings. It experiences the world in terms of feelings, or it acts on the world in terms of will. These are independent principles that are not addressed by Sankhya's instrument of the inner knower. And thirdly, we have the mental body which knows, which is really much closer to what we talked about in Sankhya. And then we have bodies that are more cosmic. We have a causal body that may be thought of as the one from whom the sealing that has got cut in the avidya. The sense of the one and the sense of the law by which the many are kept controlled or within this matrix of activity that we are calling Prakriti. Where did the laws come from? That question is not answered by Sankhya. But Vedanta will say there is a supermind that really has the logos of God, through which the laws of nature are manifesting. And we have a body that is in unison with that. That is the causal body. And finally, there is a bliss body, a body that is all intelligent and yet whose characteristic is bliss because it is completely free. Freedom and bliss are synonymous. So those are the 5 bodies. Now, these 5 bodies are going to give us different ways of understanding the relationship between Purusha and Prakriti. In case you all are becoming a little restive, I'm going to finish very soon. But these are the 5 metaphysical layers. And what Sri Aurobindo will do is he will look at the instrument, not only an instrument of knowledge, but an instrument of feeling, an instrument of acting, of willing, etc. And so he will go one step further. Look at the fact that the Sankhya schema, which had to do really with creating a reductive instrument of knowledge, can now be moved into a Vedantic schema in which you have 3 different bodies, and then moved into a more differentiated schema in Tantra where you have 7 centers. Each of these centers is a focus of a different kind of consciousness. And therefore, in each of these centers, Purusha and Prakriti are going to have a different kind of relationship. So we find that Sankhya is going to move from its reductive sphere to a new necessary and sufficient description. A sufficient and necessary and sufficient description that is taking into account the bodies of the Taittiriya Upanishad and the centers of Tantra. And here we come to the full-fledged Sankhya of Sri Aurobindo, of the Integral Yoga. And here you can see what I mean. Here above is the self. This is Satchitananda. Here you can say this is actually not just Atman, Jivatman or self, but Supreme Person, Purushottama, Supreme Lord, Parameshwara, and Supreme Self, Paramatman. Those 3 descriptions of God, they are right here. That has entered into innumerable creatures as the Purusha immanent in us, what is called by Gita the Shara Purusha, which Sri Aurobindo and the Mother are going to call the psychic being. The psychic being is the immanent Purusha in each of us. This immanent Purusha then is behind each of the three bodies that we know as the mental, vital and physical bodies, as the mental, vital and physical Purusha. What we call the Purusha of Sankhya is the mental Purusha, because that is governing the knowledge instrument. What it is in relationship to is the mental Prakriti. The mental Prakriti is going to map into three of the centers of the tantric system. This is the 1,000-petal lotus, the crown chakra, and the throat chakra. The immanent Purusha is also going to influence the body of life or the vital being and be the vital Purusha. And there it's going to have its connection with three centers. These are the heart center, the navel center, and the sex center. And down here, the Purusha is going to be the self of the body, of the physical being, and from there control the root chakra or the Muladhara. This system is what we are given, and the entire work of the integral yoga is in actually understanding this system, just as in Sankhya, understanding these constituents, seeing their relationships, and residing in the true centers of the Purusha. In other words, what is the mental Purusha? What is the vital Purusha? What is the physical Purusha? Can we go behind to the psychic being? And can we replace these by the psychic being? Can the psychic being come to the front? This idea of coming to the front and becoming the leader of the immanent instrumentation. That is one way of proceeding. Another way of proceeding is to go exactly as Sankhya in the system called Sankhya was telling us to do, but with another goal. And Sri Aurobindo gives us that method also. That is, don't look for the psychic being, but look for the mental Purusha. Find that particular separation between the instrument of knowledge and the knower. Okay? If we can create that separation, what Sri Aurobindo is saying is, don't stop there. Get to the witness, Sakshi, the witness. But the witness, if you can really reside there without accepting that as the last step, shows itself to be more potent and shows itself to have the power of veto over the activities of nature. Now this is also there in Sankhya, in the Sankhya Karika that we were talking about. In the Gita, without actually explaining what these mean, three terms are used. Sakshi, which means witness, Anumanta, which means giver of sanction, and Ishvara, which means Lord. In the separation of Purusha and Prakriti at the mental Purusha level, which is what Sankhya is talking about, we stop at being a witness and wait for the activity to fall off. But if we exercise the power of the witness, it can show itself as a giver of sanction. In other words, once your witnessing gaze can look upon the activities that are going on inside your internal psychological space, you can actually will it to stop those activities. You can say, I don't want this. Stop. And the activity stops. Therefore, the Purusha becomes active as the giver of sanction. Sri Aurobindo is saying the Purusha can take a third step. It can jump from the mental Purusha to the Purusha and the Vidya. It can unite with the Purushottama. And it does that in a gradual process by which Purushottama sends its directions to the Purusha. And instead of being only a giver of sanction, it becomes a creative will. It can actually tell you what to do. It can act on the instruments and make them do things they never knew they could do. That's when it becomes an Ishvara. And it has transited out of the Sankhya system into the Vedantic system and become the Supreme Lord, Parameshvara. That concludes Sri Aurobindo's Sankhya.